do we make sure that the AI systems will deliver what we want? In this session, we will provide a discussion, a conversation on the requirements for building an ecosystem for the assessment, governance, and risk management for AI. By the end of this session, we hope that you will have gained a greater understanding of the requirement for reliable assessment and reporting on the quality of AI systems and their governance. We invite you to join us in building a community of engagement for ongoing work on AI system assessment and reporting. With me today, I have Wan-Si Lee, Executive Director of the AI Verify Foundation, which is actively engaged in enabling the development of a global AI assurance ecosystem. She's also the Cluster Director at the IMDA, responsible for AI governance policies, which works on market-driven AI assurance as complement to other mechanisms to enable trustworthy AI. Next, we have Philip Howard, who is professor at the University of Oxford and president of the International Panel on the Information Environment. The IPIE is a global science body dedicated to strengthening the information environment through applied research, scientific consensus, and real-world impact. Next, we have Ravindran Balaraman, who is the founding head of the Center for Responsible AI, a multidisciplinary research center that conducts original research on AI evaluation metrics, benchmarks, and reporting guidelines. Then we have Anne McCormick, who is EY's global leader for public policy and digital technologies. EY is a leading global network of professional service organizations, and EY teams work across sectors and provide a spectrum of expert services spanning assurance, AI and technology risk consulting, and a range of other specialist services. Then, close to the end, we have Narayanan Vajanathan, who is the global head of policy development at the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. The ACCA is a professional educated members body for accountancy and finance professionals. They work in areas like IT audits, risk assessment, and internal controls, which are well-recognized responsibilities that many ACCA members fulfill. The ACCA works across policy maker engagement and member support. And then, last but certainly not least, we have Jibo Elias, who is working at the Stimson Center and Mozilla's Responsible Computing Challenge, where he focuses on AI governance and implementation in emerging ecosystems and on how assessment, auditing, and accountability mechanisms can actually function in real-world institutional contexts rather than remaining theoretical frameworks. Just before I invite my distinguished delegates to start their opening remarks, let me provide a brief overview of some of the type of assessments that we will be discussing. One of these is governance assessments. These are evaluating the internal governance structures surrounding AI systems. How do we make sure that the AI systems embedded within our organization are being managed in the right kind of way? Next, we have conformity assessments. These determine compliance with any applicable laws, regulations, but also voluntary standards and contractual requirements. And importantly also, of course, there is performance assessment, measuring the AI systems against predefined quality and performance metrics. Each of these types of assessments look at different dimensions, and it is important to understand which dimension has been assessed, what exactly one is reporting on. While performing and reporting on any of these assessments, it's important to have clarity on the purpose of the assessment, the subject matter of the assessment, the methodology, criteria against which the assessment is performed, as well as, importantly, the required qualifications and accountability and the absence of conflict of interest of AI assessment providers. So with this context having been laid, Let me start off with you, 1C, and ask you if you could perhaps share from your perspective on the importance of AI assurance in supporting responsible AI development and how it complements existing mechanisms such as regulation.
Thanks, Ansgar. Very, very happy to be here today. All of you can hear me well from the back of the room as well? No hands, so I assume they can't hear me, but it's okay. But all right, that's coming back to the topic. Yes, how can assurance, right, and assessment support regulations, and what we are also looking at is market-driven assurance. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. The analogy I like to use, at least in terms of assurance can support regulations, is in aviation industry. We have regulations that say planes must be safe. So because it's important, right, that as more and more people travel, you don't want accidents to happen in aviation. But how do you make sure that planes are safe? And that's where the technical assessment comes in. That's where the skills and the ability to actually measure and test for safety is important. And that's one element of how assessment is important, and that's why I talk about compliance and so on. But at the same time, in AI, unlike in aviation, you're going to have so many applications and so many different contexts in which AI is used. It's going to be in healthcare, it's going to be in financial services, in employment, and of course in aviation as well, right? And how then do you figure out, how do you test for safety or test for reliability in each of these areas? Do we have laws in all of these areas to actually define very clearly this is the expectations? How many of you think that our laws today are sufficient to clarify expectations? Nobody, right? Yeah. We have, I mean, countries have defined horizontal laws. I think that's very important. I think on the product safety side, it's also very important to start identifying what's important in each of these sectors. But at the same time, I think citizens are saying, or consumers are saying, I worry about how I'm interacting with the AI. I worry about whether this AI system is actually handling my data properly. I worry about whether I'm getting the right information. And on the company side, they worry about reliability of the contents that are being shown to their customers. They worry about security. Are their systems going to be a bit more easily infiltrated because of AI? And a host of other factors. So we think there's actually an opportunity here, besides compliance with regulations, for market-driven assurance. What we mean by that is organizations who want to demonstrate that the AI products and services are actually meeting safety expectations of their customers and their stakeholders will need to find a way to do that. And that's where this assurance component comes in. That's why a lot of the work that we do in Singapore is really figuring out how do we create technical standards, how do we look at technical capacity and capabilities to do this testing. And it's highly dependent on context and highly dependent on use cases at this stage. Before we can generalize it, a test for financial application, a chatbot that provides financial advice to a user will be very different from a test for hospital looking at triaging use cases before it sends the patient to the right department. So risk testing in very specific contexts is important, right? And that's why we've started work on this, what we call a global assurance sandbox, that brings together testers, third-party testers, to do technical testing, as well as provide some level of assurance, as well as deployers, real-life deployers who are trying to implement AI today, who wants to benefit from the use of AI and are trying to demonstrate to their board, to their shareholders, to their customers, that the implementation is going to be addressing some risks that everybody worries about. So the sandbox actually allows us to start, understanding how do you think about testing, and then eventually coalescing this into general policies and guidelines and standards that everybody can benefit from. So you can go to the AI Verify Foundation website, look up the Global Assurance Sandbox. We have some already, more than 20 to 30 use cases in flight. Some are already completed, and we have interesting case studies. And what we'll take from these case studies is to then move these into hopefully policy guidelines as well as standards. We invite all to participate on the sandbox with us. So hopefully that gives you a sense of, one, regulations is important, compliance. At the same time, I think given where we are in terms of use of AI today and adoption across many, many sectors, and the speed in which technology is moving, I think firms wanting to show that they are actually implementing AI well is also just as important. And that's where assurance comes in.
Thank you very much, Wansi. You highlighted that this is a developing space and that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done to establish really what does a good AI assurance ecosystem look like. And the IPIE has been doing work in this space, so could I invite you, Phil, to perhaps fill us in on some of the findings that you've had from that work?
Thank you. Thank you, Ansgar. And thank you all for coming and the invitation to speak to you today. My name is Phil Howard. I'm a professor at the University of Oxford, but more important, I'm on leave as the head of the International Panel on the Information Environment based in Zurich. And we're a group of scientists, some 500 scientists now from over 75 countries, who specialize in technology issues. We've run a scientific panel on AI and peace building. We currently have a panel on AI and economic inclusion, right, bringing everyone in to the benefits of AI. One of our first scientific panels to run was a panel on global standards for AI auditing. And the reason we started with this as a project for the IPIE was to help establish that it is possible to speak of global standards for AI. It is reasonable to expect firms to share model cards as part of an auditing process. We can develop language around data provenance. It's reasonable to expect a firm to explain where it gets its data before it trains models. Having established all of this with our engineers, our engineering community, we've moved on to this question of what an audit should look like, and we've all had experience with the myriad of laws, the myriad regulations that are now in play in jurisdictions around the world. The law barely keeps up, right? It rarely keeps ahead of it's rarely ever ahead of the technology. The technologies move so quickly. The scientists innovate, industry implements. And one of the lessons from our work on AI auditing is that the best way to build confidence in an effectively audited AI system is to rely on several different kinds of groups to settle on terms and to conduct the audits. Industry self-regulation rarely ever works. You need community groups, you need government regulators, and government regulators on their own shouldn't forge ahead, without consulting with industry. So it's this shared conversation across different types of actors that helps define what good governance looks like and what it would mean in the context of AI. Now, working ahead, there are a number of social issues, including social inclusion. We want to make sure that AI systems benefit everyone. To get there, I think the next challenge for us is to agree on how often, how regularly an AI audit should occur, under what circumstances an AI system is actually high risk. Some of the AI applications are relatively low risk, and require different kinds of oversight. But the message I want to leave with you with these opening remarks is that this has to be a collective conversation, right? Moving ahead with a particular sector without some sense of oversight and shared language, shared conversation is very likely to leave the other players out of the loop and very likely to result in less confidence, less public trust in the AI systems we use and the business operations that implement. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. One of the things that you mentioned is that the diversity of areas where AI is being used means we need to have specialized insights into the challenges that comes in each of these. And this is one of the areas where, Ravi, you've been looking into the sector-specific challenges. So please, if you could share some of your findings in that space.
Sure. So once again, I joined the other panelists in thanking all the people who actually found their way to this room. And again, thanks for the invite to be on this panel. And I kind of agree with what Wansi and Phil have said so far, in that there is no single framework that's going to work for all sectors, right? So if you look at the India's governance guidelines, even there we have recommended that each individual sectoral regulator should take a relook at what is it that they are doing right now, and figure out how AI is challenging those regulations and what are the gaps that they should cover up, as instead of directly starting a conversation on overarching AI regulation. Right? So I think it has to be, again, like what Phil said, it has to be a much more collaborative effort. And to tell you how hard some of this can be, I'll give you an example of something that happened in one of the things that we were doing. So there are these computational models that people use to estimate the age of a fetus, right, from scans. And many of these computational models have been, based on, Western babies, right? And they underestimate Asian babies by as much as 30 to 40%. Underestimate the age of the Asian babies by 30 to 40%. So almost making the, the inferred age medically useless, right? So what we did, so we actually, worked with a couple of hospitals and built the model. Some of my colleagues built this model, and they got this to be very, very accurate in predicting the age of the fetus. And then they go and show this to some doctors, and the doctors say, you are using the head circumference of the fetus as one of the features that you're using for the prediction. All of this is great. I mean, it passed all our internal testing. The laboratory testing was good, and all the held out said, all the things that the machine learning people would do, it performed very well. But the doctor said, you were able to measure the head circumference accurately because the images that you were using were gathered under very strict quality control. And that's not what happens in the field. So if I take your model and deploy it in the field, it's probably going to be more erroneous than the Western model that I have been using already, because the quality of scans we get, you cannot measure the head circumference. Right? So we had to go back and now work with features which the doctor said, I can measure accurately even on low quality scans. And even then we managed to get a good model now. So right now it's in field testing around various hospitals in the country. But the point is, there is no way you can talk about assurance of your model. No way you can talk about verification of the model unless the people who are using it, right, are involved in the evaluation pipeline as well. I mean, otherwise you're going to work in a vacuum and come up with these kinds of metrics which are great in work but useless in practice. I can keep going on. I mean, there are so many different domains in which we have found out that people have been reporting many metrics which are not useful when I have to take decisions about deployability of the systems. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So as you said, it's very much a developing field. So let's get there.
Thank you very much. And yes, with the need for having specialized kind of understanding in order to be able to properly assess whether this is an AI system that can be valuably used, may I perhaps turn to you, Anne, for some insights as to how industry is actually looking at this space, and also where the value is for a lot of industry in getting, for instance, third-party assessments.
I hope you can hear me, and thank you, Ansgar. No, I mean, bringing a business perspective to this, EY works across all sectors and works global north, global south, very different societies and environments, including environments that are highly regulated and environments that are highly unregulated. We've really seen a shift over the last, I would say, 2 years, which is interesting. More and more the conversation is around embedding AI, less about adoption. So businesses are trying to make sure they get the value out of AI, that they know how to run it properly. But also boards and C-suites, so executives and others, are still struggling with the complexity of the systems and the use cases. And a lot is around the unknowns, right? What are the unknowns? Am I sure I know what I don't know? Of course I don't, right? So what we've seen is the growing need to build confidence in the AI systems that are either being bought, if you're buying them in and adapting, the systems that you're deploying, and perhaps systems that you're then selling to customers. Systems that are affecting your operations, your bottom line, but also potentially your ability to recruit and keep the best talent. Do these systems reflect the ethics that you are associating with your brand, or are they out of step? And are these systems trustworthy by your customers, and beyond your customers, your stakeholders, so governments, communities in which your employees and your brands operate. So this question, this challenge of understanding what's in the black box, or whether your systems are doing what they should do is really kind of becoming more better defined in the minds of boards, C-suites, but also we're starting to see more questions coming from two other communities, which I think is still anecdotal but interesting. One is the investor community. Is my money, is my investment being well protected? Do I understand if I'm buying into a business? Do I understand how this business is governing AI and how they're managing the value of that AI and the risks? And we're starting to see also questions coming from very big insurers. Do I insure some of these systems? What does it mean about the insurance products and services that I have been offering, given the widespread use and embedding of these systems, which are still, phenomenal, full of promise, but also still not necessarily well used or sometimes surprising. So what we've been seeing really is more and more interest in the use of assessments, AI assessments, whether they be AI audits, as you said, Ansgar, they're also called AI assurance. A lot of focus has been around assuring the governance and the management systems. So for example, with ISO 42001, this standards ISO, so the governance, if you like, around the use of the systems. There's also a lot of interest around compliance. Are the compliance obligations being properly managed and addressed? There's a lot of talk around assessment of the systems themselves. Really, the debate is ongoing as to whether proper assessments of of the system itself, of the algorithms, is workable, is trustworthy. There need to be very clear criteria, pre-established criteria, whether they be quality, operational, or other, against which these assessments are made. And that's very challenging. But what we're seeing is a lot of interest that goes well beyond compliance. We're seeing businesses looking at this as a governance question. And some of them are even starting to think about this as a source of competitive advantage. So yes, you might have some legal and regulatory obligations, but if you're running a good business, if you've got a good brand that you're building, if you're trying to distinguish yourself from your competitors, how do you have some sort of a marker that your use of AI systems or the systems that you're putting out in the market as services or products, how do you show to your customers and other stakeholders that they do what you're expecting them to do, that you understand the risks, that you manage them well, and that you're able to manage the value around that? So we're seeing kind of this shift from compliance to governance to actually strategic management of value. And the conversation is developing. Some countries are still very focused on regulation, though we're also seeing, for example, in Europe, a bit of a easing of the focus of hard regulation towards a more pragmatic mix of regulation against the highest risk, and perhaps more flexibility and more time to learn around the risks that are still, less well defined, or that might, if over-regulated, slow down necessary innovation. I think where I'd like to kind of conclude is to give a couple of practical examples. I mean, we're seeing, without giving company names, we're seeing at one end, of course, in financial services, a highly regulated industry, the use of AI, the risk assessments, whether it's using kind of a NIST type risk framework or other frameworks, to really make sure that the financial service leaders are cognizant of the risks, that the risk management is embedded in corporate governance and reporting where appropriate. But we're also seeing, for example, in very large FMCG consumer good products, one leading global company, not just looking at voluntary third-party AI assessments to understand how AI systems are used in their organization, but they're also starting to use it in a way to define some KPIs for themselves, make sure that accountability is clearly defined in their organizations, and with a view to start putting themselves out as an example which other players in their value chain, their suppliers, right, their partners, are asked to emulate. So putting themselves first, using these assessments as strong benchmarks and third-party, perspective and objectivity and independence to to make those solid, but also kind of pulling the ecosystem, pulling the value chain along them. So lots of examples to watch and a developing space.
Thank you very much, Anne. Very interesting and to hear how the demand for these types of assessments is coming from multiple directions. Now, so far, we've heard about the kinds of assessments that companies are looking for, the kinds of assessments and challenges around this from a system or organization's perspective. But one of the big challenges, of course, is who's doing these assessments, and are they doing them in a way that others can rely on, and also that can compare results from various different assessment providers. This is obviously a space where the ACCA is active. So Narayanan, if you could share some of your insights from the work that you've been doing.
Thanks, Ansgar. So I guess from an ACCA perspective, our interest is in professionalizing of AI assurance as a discipline. So what I mean by that is really understanding this is a relatively new space, and at parts of it could seem a bit like the Wild West. But we think there's both a need and an opportunity to understand how we can streamline how AI assurance, or contribute to streamlining how AI assurance is thought about across the ecosystem. That's the conversation we have with policymakers around the world. And that's where we, as a global body, seek to share best practice examples from one part of the world to another. Because the more there's a common understanding as AI scales, if you want to trust AI as it scales, you need to trust the AI assurance process that goes with it. And if that is very confused and not very streamlined, that will introduce risks to confidence and trust. Now, in terms of professionalizing AI assurance as a discipline, we see broadly 2 or 3 key pillars to that. The first pillar is, and which has been alluded to before, developing a common understanding of what do we mean by AI assurance. For us, there are probably some simple things that go with it. One is, what specific attributes of the AI system are we looking to test? Secondly, what is the basis for the testing or the methodology, and are we willing to share that with people who are consuming the AI assurance report? And thirdly, are we ending up with a pass-fail? So either you pass the test or you don't. The reason I say that is because you might do a very insightful report about an AI system, telling you all about its design factors, its pros, its cons, how it can be improved, where it could be best utilized. That might still not be an AI assurance report if it doesn't really do those things I just described in terms of what did we test, how did we test it, and did it pass or fail. I think linked to that is a common understanding of terminology. You talk about assurance, assessments, AI audits, risk reviews, compliance reviews, I could go on. So there needs to be clarity about what these things mean. And also, what level of confidence are you looking to give from an AI assurance engagement? You might have something which is quick and dirty for some certain types of AI systems. You might have certain very high stakes, high value situations where you need a much higher level of confidence. And the AI assurance, the way it's communicated of what it is, needs to take that into account. So as I said, from an ACCA perspective, we're speaking to policymakers around the world on a few things. One is this idea of common, and I would invite any others in that space who want to talk to us, please reach out. We're happy to have the conversation, but it's about common understanding. It's about sharing best practice globally. It's also about explaining the value of AI assurance. A government can't just set rules top down and expect everything to happen. AI assurance will give you a bottom-up mechanism where, if it's streamlined properly, providers will create a marketplace where high-quality AI becomes something that is almost part of an industry that's developed within an ecosystem. So that's the key thing. I think there's a couple of other small pillars. One, well, not small, but pillars that I would say alongside that. Two is placing ethics at the core. So I think we were talking a little earlier about the sandbox, and I think those are essentially very, very important. In India, we talk about a techno-legal framework, and the idea of embedding compliance within the design of the AI is very sensible, and it's correct. But it's also the case that we have to make sure that alongside technical testing, we have the thought of the human in the loop. I think Ravi's example about the circumference of the brain really highlighted that, of the head. So this idea about human in the loop, and this idea about transparency. So what is assurable, what isn't, and I think Anne, sort of referred to that in something she was talking about. So if you're not ethical and come across as ethical as an AI assurance product and industry, no matter how clever the technical testing is, people will not trust it. So it's really important to bear that in mind. And I think the final pillar, I'd say, is skills, education and skills. We are an education body, a professional member education body. We train 500,000 students in 180 countries. So the point is, people need to understand what AI is first, and then to understand what AI assurance is, and then to understand how to get value from an AI assurance output. We are embedding it into our own qualification. We are thinking about how we include electives like data science into our qualification. For an accounting qualification, that is relatively new. So the point being that when we put all of this together, AI assurance is something which is new, but also something which is very familiar, because areas like assurance, risk assessment, and analysis can be transferred. There's a lot of transferable learning to be had there. So I'll pause there, and I'll pass across then, if I may, to...
Thank you very much, Narayanan. I think you very nicely and clearly laid out sort of the core principles that need to be followed in order to be able to get real reliability out of these kinds of assessments. Now, so far we've heard a lot of insights regarding what is needed in order to have these assessments really deliver good value. But I think one of the questions that will be on many people's minds is, what does this look like in the reality when we get to do this in practice, where things aren't ideal? This is an area that you've been engaging in, Jibu, so please, we all would like to know.
Yeah, thank you, Ansgar. So I work in the intersection of AI governance, public policy, socio-economic impact of AI, and implementation on ground, especially from a global south perspective. And currently my focus is mostly about how we can build institutional capacity for responsible AI in our universities and in our public systems as well. So here I'm going to speak from a practitioner's lens, from a global south perspective. So looking at what actually happens when these policies, these standards, how does this look like in a real world environment, or environment which are much not prepared. So when it comes to assessment, if you want to build real trust, right, the question is not about standards, right, or lack of standards, but there are many standards out there, but it's all about how these standards actually look in less, how do I say, less matured environment. You know, it plays very well in highly mature corporate environments, but that's not the case, because often I felt that the conversation around AI assessment and assurance assumes that most deployers are large companies with compliance team, and and assuming that there is a stable regulatory institution, and importantly, access to specialized auditors, right? But if you look at countries like India or Global South, a large level of deployment happens in very different environments. Like Professor Ravi mentioned, it happens in public hospitals, right? State education systems, or small fintech employers, or local government bodies, universities. So these deployment doesn't have the kind of infrastructure and pipeline to have efficient AI assurance or evaluation framework. And most importantly, there are quite a lot of challenges or barriers as well. For example, but they are not technical in nature. They are mostly institutional in nature, right? So we have a huge shortage of trained evaluators. And look at the fragmented standards across various jurisdictions, right? And importantly, there is an unclear incentives for companies to share information. And finally, the lack of affordable tools, especially for institutions like ones I mentioned. So I think if we can come across a roadmap, a common goal, a common agreeable roadmap, then we would have a system where governments procuring AI systems which have built-in evaluation requirements, or universities teaching assurance alongside AI and ML courses, right? So, and open source and open tools are available, which will bring down the cost of testing as well. And importantly, cross-jurisdiction calibration is required. so that these results can be interoperable across the globe as well. So that's what I hope for, but I will stop here for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jibu. I think these are very critical elements that you've raised on how do we translate from the conceptual thinking to the reality. And you very nicely open it up to what we are looking to work towards, getting a roadmap towards having an AI assurance ecosystem that large parts of the world are at least partially agreeing with, so that we can get interoperability between assessments. So this next is going to be an open question to everybody on the panel. And actually, I would also like people in the audience to think whether or not they have some views on this. So in the later part, I can maybe go to you. So really, when we are looking to create an ecosystem of AI assessments, the idea is that this will be a way towards building trust that people, organizations, and governments need in order to gain the benefits that AI can bring. But what do you think are the core ingredients that would make this successful? And this is an open question. Please, who would like to start? Okay.
I actually agree with Jibu's few points that he raised, and we've tried all of that. We're doing training. We've put out open source testing tools. We tried to see how to make it practical and what's happening to people on the ground. And I think the experience is that you really need to do it, right? I think it's very hard to talk about it at a conceptual level, as you mentioned. And that's why I think this idea of actually testing the systems, whether it's a system, so we have one particular example where it's a financial services system where it's an agentic implementation where you have an agentic system pulling sources from different parts of a bank in terms of databases and so on, and making a recommendation to a customer and some kinds of investment suggestions, let's say over an email. So that requires multiple steps and multiple tasks. How do you think about assuring a system like this? Is it that the email must be correct? Is it that the in-between steps has to be correct? And how do you go about technically defining it? So that's one, right? The methodology in terms of assurance is important. What the bank cares about is also important. So when we ask, so what's your threshold? I mean, we talk about pass or fail, right? So what's your threshold for passing or failing something? Actually, is it 90% generally accurate is good enough? Or is it 85%? I think that's a really difficult decision for banks to make, right? Or for any organization to make. So they must be sufficiently comfortable to release this. And clearly, none of my fellow regulators are defining thresholds today. And what we need is really to see what's coming up from the ground. So this bottom-up conversation that we have been talking about just now is really important, because with data, then we can start understanding where the trends are, and then be able to then set the water level accordingly. And it's also different for different use cases. So that's why a lot of experimentation, a lot of trying, a lot of doing, it's extremely important. And this is the practical way to move it forward. On the one hand, we should define our standards and our expectations. On the other, actually get things moving from the ground. That's why, again, I'll just say that that's why we wanted to do this assurance sandbox, because it's really about trying and doing, hopefully then be able to coalesce some best practices. But with enough of us doing this around the world, and hopefully we have sufficient data to be able to start understanding where we feel about these things, specific to use cases, and then start setting some standards in the longer term.
Ravi?
So I want to go back to a point that Jibu made earlier, right? So one of the biggest challenges for us, especially in the global south, right? So even if you want to set standards, I mean, how you normally set standards, I mean, you have some benchmarks against which you'll evaluate it, but there are no benchmarks for things that we would like to test in the global south. So I'll give you an example, right? So you would like to make sure that your language model is sanitized, right? It is not, outputting swear words. I mean, do we have a dictionary of swear words in, I don't know, in Santali? Right, we don't. right? So we don't even have that kind of resources in the global south, where you can go back and say, "Hey, look, here are the standards, and these are the tools for you to ensure that your AI is meeting those standards," because we don't have that for a large fraction of the geography. So that's something that we really have to work on, right? So one of the things that we are hoping that will come out as an outcome of the summit is the setting up of a global south-focused, tool repository that will allow us to do this in a more reliable manner. So that's something that we certainly need to do to make sure that we have more assurance in the AI tools.
Thank you. Jibu?
I think to add to the roadmap, what Ravi and Vinci just mentioned, one thing, just a thought, we can do is build more capacity beyond regular auditors. How we can think about assurance as a largely distributed capability, right? So it will be like faculties in universities and colleges will get to evaluate the models that are deployed in the class. Who's better, to do that than them? Or domain experts can do the same with models, deployed in animal husbandry or agriculture or many other fields as well, right? And interestingly, I think Ravi was mentioning before that the users also needs to have a say in how these models are evaluated. So that brings me to the idea of how we have to mention, how we can empower civil society groups to also to audit public deployment of AIs as well. So, and not to disconnect technical skills here, we also need the technical skills for testing and documentation as well. So this can be one of the recipes, or however you say, for the roadmap,
Maybe if I can.
Phil?
Thank you. I like the direction of this conversation because it seems that we all need each other, right? So the research community can produce these lexicons for hate speech, misinformation, or bias. The scientific community does work on these things. And in very important ways, we've found that governance is a key feature, because having an understanding of what your exciting new tool does and showing that you have some oversight is an important demonstration to the rest of us that you put in a good faith effort. In fact, we already know what independent auditing looks like, what good audit systems look like. There needs to be some independence. You need feedback loops from your consumers, the people who are using your toolkit, and the assessments need to be done with some arm's length relationships. So in an important way, we all need each other.
Yeah, if I can just quickly build on, I think absolutely right. I think to what Jibu was saying, I think you're talking about a distributed, distributing the capability. And within, for example, the accountancy stand. So firstly, I think global harmonization to the extent that's realistic, and while taking into account local needs, at least certain principles, so everybody's not reinventing the wheel and overfitting regulatory approaches when there are certain common things that people can learn from each other very quickly. But also, I think if you look at domains as well, like in accountancy, there's, let's say, the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board that sets audit and assurance standards for 200 countries around the world. They have a standard ISA 3000 at the moment, which will talk about how to go about assurance as a general principle without thinking about AI. So you don't need to start from a standing start. There are obviously lots of other standards, IEEE, various others, which are all interconnected. They're not contradicting or duplicating, in fact. They might give you criteria for AI, while something else like this might give you criteria for what assurance steps looks like. So there's something here around making sure, and within that standard, in fact, there is a specific proviso for something called a practitioner's expert. So you could be someone who's not a technical developer, but you could work with a technical developer to conduct an assurance engagement. So these norms exist, and it's about really all of us across the ecosystem working together to really maximize things which are out there while building new norms as well.
I think you make a really great point. I mean, just trying to step back and look at this in a, look at the differences across the ecosystem. At one end, you have the frontier kind of models with either high risks or unknown risks. And there, tools like sandboxes, other cooperation with academics and transparency is important. There also are these AI safety institutes that have started to come up in different countries following the Bletchley Summit, which was the first of these summits, whatever it was, 3-4 years ago. What's key here is sharing information, sharing learning, and building a better understanding of how these models work in real life. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is kind of mainstream, mid-sized businesses that are looking for investment, that are looking to protect a brand, that are trying to communicate to their employees, their customers, their partners, their investors, whether their use and their embedding of AI is kind of, is it done properly? Are you running your business properly? You happen to have AI, well, that's another thing you have to run properly, but you're still having to run your business properly. And what's important there is having kind of comparable assessments. So back to what are some of the emerging standards, not overcomplicating, but identifying some areas where, there are certain risk categorizations that are comparable across geographies. There are certain tools to assess and standards like ISO standards to assess whether if you like, the management system or the governance around the use of higher risk AI systems or higher risk use, how is that done? It's really important that those assessments are robust. It doesn't mean complicated. Robust does not mean necessarily complicated. It means clear. It means done by a qualified expert. It could even be an internal expert. Ideally, it's an external independent third party. But there is, if you like, a need in the ecosystem for comparable basic kind of labels saying this is well governed, this is safe, you should only use this in these circumstances, and carry on doing business. So I think there are different dimensions to this question of assessments. We're all still learning, and certainly, as a business person myself, what I find most promising in this space is back to what Phil, you were saying, the dialogue with policymakers in Ujibu, with policymakers, but also with academics. As a European, having been part of the dialogue on the EU Digital Services Act, whatever it was 3-4 years ago, what was very noticeable is we were no longer looking at laws that were set. Here's the law, here it is, go implement it. It was, this is what we think you should be doing, here are some things we're going to be checking on, and let's keep talking because we're going to need to develop guidelines with you as we understand how this works and doesn't work in the years ahead. And I think that's a new way to kind of look at governance, voluntary and regulation-driven approaches to this space. We are learning, we need to be transparent, we need to be clear about where the greatest risks are and what are the needs of society, investors, and communities in this space.
If I may just
Go ahead.
Just quickly add on to what Anne just said. I absolutely agree. I think there are many dimensions. I think for many of us in this room, we are more worried about application, about how we're using AI. We clearly worried about frontier models, but that's a different set of assurance altogether. But right now, it's about application and use cases and how AI is actually going to be adopted and deployed by all of us so that we can all be able to enjoy its benefits. And that's why I think the conversation here is really about how then do we build that capability to reliably deploy AI and be assured that it's actually going to be useful and safe, right? I think the point about testing is important, and Narayan made the point about, what are some of the common issues around that we need to test for. We've done some work in that space. We actually identified things like reliability, hallucination, undesirable content, security as some common areas that all sectors and all companies need to worry about, and put out a testing toolkit that helps people understand how to go about thinking about testing. In that context, it's not one size fits all, but at least in these common dimensions, how do you think about testing? So it's called a starter kit for testing LLM applications, not LLMs, but LLMs applications. The lead author is here, Akriti is here today. I just wanted to point out in case you want to find out. And hopefully it's a good resource for all of you in the room. Yeah.
Great. I think one of the common threads that you've all brought in is this is a journey that we're on learning how to really do this. And in order to do that learning, it means getting into this, doing it, testing it, as we're doing it, finding out where the challenges are so that we can then bring that up also into the conversations with policymakers, with standard setters, in order to get those details in there. As somebody who's also engaging in some of their standardization work and having had conversations with policymakers, I've been in the room where I've had observed the ping pong back and forth. We need a clear criteria of this is good enough. Well, we're not the ones who are qualified because we don't have the expertise. But we are not the ones who are qualified because we don't actually have the mandate for this. Who's going to be able to get to what are the criteria? And it's something that needs to be explored. As I mentioned, I do want to be able to go to the room if possible. I realize we don't have a microphone, so I encourage you to shout it out, and I'll repeat what you said in order to get it for people online to also hear. First.
Some great points discussed right now. My question is mainly to Dr. Howard, and obviously those panel if you find it relevant. I need to bring up sport tennis, but yesterday the Wall Street Journal reported that Anthropic's flawed AI was used in the Venezuela operation. So we're talking all about regulation, and regulation is great. And I think Dr. Howard, you mentioned that we should try and make sure that there is a coordination between government and sort of companies. So how can we ensure that the responsible use of AI upholds things like international law and minimizes harm? I mean, like Mr. Vaidyanathan said, how do we put ethics at the core of AI when looking at sort of the assessment and building confident practices?
Thank you. Please go ahead. Yeah, okay, we'll take one more question. We don't have that much time. Please, behind you there.
Hi, good morning.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think the question that the guy asked, pretty much mine is on the same line. So it's in yellow fonts, it's written, establishing the foundation of responsible confidence in AI. I mean, and you guys are talking about a bottom-top approach more than the top-to-down approach, but we just saw when Grok went live, we should look at the usage. Everybody had a field day in the name of anonymity, right? And we know how the Moltbook thing was transpiring. Finally, MIT came out saying that this was more on the human side, not really AI agents which were doing it. But it did set the alarm bells ringing, right? I'm in education publishing sector. I hate AI because with one prompt, a 300-pager book could be written in a minute. I'm not a fan of that, but we have to implement it because the higher management wants it. But from a B2C standpoint, you really need to put the legal framework in place before you give this thing called AI to the users, because they're having a field day without facing any consequences. But I really feel it needs to be top to down. It could be very hard. We've not achieved success with the internet. We know what all happens on the internet. But now this is a new technology, and I really feel that unless and until the legal framework is put in place, this technology should not be introduced, especially to B2C. In B2B, yes, somebody said that the frameworks are there so that the regulation can happen, but when B2C comes in, it becomes really difficult. So I want to know if somebody can have an end.
And we have 1 minute for some answers to these questions. Go ahead.
My quick response would be that some of the questions are great, some of it's a little out of scope for what we've been talking about today. But I would offer, and I don't know the particular Wall Street Journal article, I would offer that this is also a good moment for corporate leadership. So we do have international norms around human rights, yes. There is an international multi-party signatory statements on what human rights, the Code of Human Rights are. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of philosophers who've given us ethical criteria to reach for. This is a moment where corporations can lead, right, show that they've done their due diligence, and in so doing, help regulators understand what reasonable, high, but reasonable bars can be set.
Can I just add one thing? The gentleman mentioned the Grok incident, and also the reason why we are advocating for assessment and assurance is to prevent this kind of things. I mean, not just like large scale issues, not from happening. I think once he mentioned about the other sectors, right, the aviation and many other sectors where you have this kind of systems in place. So, I mean, just want to add that.
I'm afraid we have run out of time. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do invite you to join us on this journey. The QR code that you see up there will lead you to a link that shows good to report that we've done on this topic. This is a report between EY and ACCA, which also references work by Singapore IMDA as well as the IPIE. Please do join us on this if this is an area that you are interested in. Thank you very much.